right? So the standard definitions of personality in psychology are just any kind of persistent uh, pattern in people's behavior and experience over time. That's part of your personality. So, if you're a basketball enthusiast and you play a pickup game every week, then that love of basketball and engagement in it is part of your personality over time. And whenever we ask, you ask somebody like, what's this person like? We're talking about what their personality is, even if we don't use those broad terms like, oh, they're an extrovert or they're really anxious, or even if we talk about what they're interested in or what they like to do, that's all part of personality from the psychological perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so the theory was basically trying to draw on these cybernetic principles to understand like what's a good definition for the parts of personality, and then how can we explain where it comes from and what are the underlying mechanisms and processes that produce it. Um, and it's the theory is called the cybernetic big five theory, uh, even though, as I just said, personality is not just the big five, but the big five are special, right? They have this kind of important place within personality because they are the major dimensions of covariation among all the more specific differences in people's personalities. Like if you just assess people on a whole 100 different characteristics, and then you look to see which ones tend to appear together within people. You use a technique called factor analysis,
Mm-hmm.
typically. You're going to get something that strongly resembles the big five. And there's debates in the field about, is a six-factor model better than a five-factor model? But these are relatively small debates because the six-factor model is basically just like a slight rearrangement of the five-factor model. It's not like really adding anything new.
Right.
Um, Even though, of course, there are six-factor model people who would, fight me to the death because I said that doesn't add anything new. But whatever, there's a reasonable consensus in the field, even if there are the kind of usual differences that scientists will argue about. Um, and so what that means is that in general, like take extroversion as an example, people who are more sociable also tend to experience more positive emotions, and to be more assertive and tending toward dominance and leadership, and they're more physically active. And so there are all these things that are kind of different from each other, but which typically appear together within people. And one of the really fascinating questions in personality to me is why? Why do these things group together? What are the underlying mechanisms that cause that kind of clustering? A lot of the research in personality psychology, especially uh, pre, I don't know, pre 2000, let's say, was much more focused on, well, in addition to just kind of figuring out like what is a good description of personality, that's where the big five comes from. That took some decades. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of the work was basically more on prediction, right? It's like, okay, we've measured somebody's personality. Now, what are the outcomes for that person likely to be based on their personality? How can we use personality to predict job success or relationship satisfaction or risk for mental health problems or well-being, or just any number of things that we might want to predict. But I was really interested in going in the other direction causally, like instead of you've got personality and what are the outcomes, rather you've got personality and where does that come from.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that kind of explains the whole interest in these underlying cybernetic mechanisms, and then the way that the brain and the way these are neurally instantiated, let's say.
Yeah. Would you say that we found some kind of neural correlates to kind of emphasize why we get these clusterings? And for example, I think of Panksepp's seven emotional circuits, right? And his attempt to kind of say, these are the seven emotions we have, and these are the circuits that drive it, and here are the evolutionary reasons. Do you see something like that for the big five, as you kind of dig deeper into this nascent field of personality neuroscience?
Yeah, absolutely. And Panksepp in some ways was tackling an easier job because he was only focused on emotions. So regular patterns in people's emotions are part of their personality, but there's more to it as well. There's various patterns of thinking and different goals that people have and all kinds of stuff. So the big five summarize more than just emotions. But actually, where we've made the most progress in neuroscience, and this isn't really surprising because of people like Panksepp and what you can do with animal research, um, the two of the big five that have the most well-established neural correlates at this point are extroversion and neuroticism, and I think that's pretty clearly because they reflect these basic individual differences in sensitivity to reward for extroversion and sensitivity to punishment for neuroticism.
Mm.
Reward and punishment are just the most basic fundamental psychological processes, and we have studied those circuits in a lot of depth in other species where it's relatively easy to do. And fortunately, all mammals have a fair degree of conservation of the way that their brain works, especially in those low-lying motivational processes. Right, it's interesting. The human brain is obviously much bigger proportionally than most other animals' brains. But if you look across mammals, like if you look at a rat, for example, everybody's favorite lab animal, the human cortex proportionally is huge. It's much bigger than the rats. But if you look at the proportions of the subcortical structures, where a lot of these motivational processes are being computed and conducted, those are very similar. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of similarity. So it is, I always bring this up in my personality course because we do a lot of discussion of neuroscience. And, people may wonder, like, is a rat really a good model of a human being? And my answer to that is that, well, there are obviously a lot of differences between humans and rats, but um, a rat brain is probably a better model of a human brain than some scientists' idea about how a human brain works, right? Because the brain is the most complicated object in the known universe, and we've got some ideas about it. We're constantly discovering new things about it, but still a lot we don't know.